me okay? I'm not going to be speaking very much at this point, so welcome. This actually, forum, we've done it as a Board of Selectmen's meeting, so we'll go through our little procedure in terms of opening the meeting. I'll do a roll call. There's three of us here right now.
Paul Schubert, present.
Kevin McCarthy, present.
Jack Creighton, present.
Okay, so the meetings now is a welcome to the to this special meeting of the Cohasset Board of Selectmen, November 18, 2019. What we're going to do, being a special meeting, just let me frame very quickly, making introductory remarks. As you can see, essentially what we're doing here, and the reason why we want to have this meeting, is to give an opportunity for the public to view what the very latest status is of the harbor plan study. It's obviously a very critical plan in the community because it involves our Cohasset Harbor. We've had 3 studies done in the last year: the master plan, the recreational plan, covering very significant aspects of the community, and this third one that we've taken on is a harbor plan. So we're laying out some very important strategic planning, as you can see. And this, the harbor plan has been going along for a period of time here, and as part of the process to bring it to its conclusion is we want to have plenty of opportunity for public input, which is one of the reasons for tonight. There'll be other opportunities in meetings too. And that's what we'll do with Lauren Lind, who's our planning director, is going to be making introductory comments. Then Emily from Harrison will be, Innes from Harrison, will be making the main body of the presentation. After that's over, what we'll do is that'll swing back to questions and answers, and at that time, you know, my policy, our policy is that we'll be here as long as people have commentary and questions that they want to have answered. So we welcome that. That's one of the main purposes of tonight. So when we come back, I'll give some framing of that, but essentially if anybody has a question, they'll come up to the podium here, ask the question, and then we have all the people in the room here tonight, the experts, to go ahead and answer that. And so that's the purposes of tonight's meeting. So with that, I'll turn the show over to Lauren.
Hi, good evening. I'm Lauren Lind. I'm the planning director here in Cohasset. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and please bear with us. We're supposed to have a presentation. We're having some technical difficulties, so we're printing up some paper copies right now, so just please bear with us for a moment. In the meantime, I just wanted to give you some background as to why we're here tonight. We're here to talk about the harbor plan. This has been a plan that has been going on for quite some time now. We began the planning process in early 2018. We're coming up on about 2 years with our consultant. I have been on board here as planning director since the middle of the summer here, so my predecessor worked very closely with our consultant in the drafting of this phase and the Harbor Committee. Thank you for your work and diligence on this. Tonight we'll hear from our consultant, Emily Innes. She's the Director of Planning at Harriman Design. It's a well-respected urban design and planning firm in Boston. She has been working diligently with, as I mentioned before my time here, and she's gotten us through several rounds of the draft. The most recent version of the draft plan is its September version. It's up available on the Harbor Committee website for those who want to have access to that document. There's also lots of presentation and FAQ material that you'll find there that may be relevant. And tonight we'll hear from Emily. She'll go over the process to date, what the next steps are, and what we have left to get to completion of this plan. So with that, I will introduce Emily. Thank you.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. You'll notice the beautiful blue screen behind me. I have a lot of images, but the good news is the first part of my presentation is actually mostly text, which I can read to you, and then hopefully that will be up and running by the time we get to the images that show the analysis. So as Lauren said, we've been working on this for a little while, since spring of 2018. We've gone through several iterations of the draft, which I will tell you about, and we're sort of at the final public process before it goes into 2 sets of approval processes, and I'll walk you through that as well. But before we get to that, let's just talk Municipal Harbor Plan 101. What is a Municipal Harbor Plan? It's important to know that this is a voluntary process that's initiated by the town. So basically, a community says, we would like to have a harbor plan, and so we're going to do this planning process. But what's interesting about it is if it's going to be a capital M, capital H, capital P municipal harbor plan, it also has a state requirement. So it is governed by 301 CMR 23, which are the regulations for the review and approval of a municipal harbor plan. And what that means is it tells you how you do it and what the content is. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. And the purpose of having this state-approved municipal harbor plan is that it guides the actions of state agencies when approving waterways, permits, and licenses. And what that means is it allows municipalities to vary certain Chapter 91 standards to meet local preferences. So Chapter 91 is the legislation that governs waterways. It governs the public interest in the waterways of the Commonwealth. And Chapter 91 has all sorts of requirements for how those waterways can be used and developed. And the key here is that certain of those requirements related to uses and dimensional standards can be varied at the local level, and that's why you have a municipal harbor plan. It's that document that allows you to do that. And so what that means is that town objectives and priorities for those things that can be varied take precedence over the standard objectives and priorities of Chapter 91, which gives the town flexibility to modify Chapter 91 to meet local needs. So rather than having this broad bit, because this is a difficulty, right, with creating legislation for the entire Commonwealth, rather than having something that broadly applies to the Commonwealth and can't be changed, the municipal harbor plan allows that tailoring. Look at that. All right, 2 seconds while I get that. So in terms of the municipal harbor plan, the Cohasset Board of Selectmen has a primary role as the policy board of the town. They requested the grant from the Seaport Economic Council, so the Seaport Economic Council provided $80,000 for the study, and there was a $20,000 match from the town. They are the designated municipal official under 301 CMR 23. This is when we start getting into those regulations for process. They appointed the Harbor Committee, and the Harbor Committee is the Harbor Planning Group under 301 CMR 23. And they designate the town's planning representative, in this case, the Director of Planning. So these three groups, the municipal official, the Harbor Planning Group, and the planning representative have specific roles under the regulations. And then the local approval process is not actually defined by 301 CMR 23. It's assumed that the town will decide how they want to do that themselves. In the request for proposal that my firm responded to, the RFP required that the Board of Selectmen would hold a public hearing and approve the plan in order to move into the state's approval process. So the process that's defined by the state is that the municipality conducts a pre-planning process to determine the overall scope of the actual planning process. And this was done, the Harbor Committee worked for quite a while to figure out what the goals and objectives should be for the planning process. Then the municipality submits a request for notice to proceed, all in capital letters, and this is sort of formally kicks off the process. And that request goes to the director of the Office of Coastal Zone Management, also known as CZM. The director of CZM issues the notice to proceed, and that's when the formal study process kicks off. Then the municipality develops and submits its plan according to the notice to proceed. So it's important to note that that is the scope for the planning process, and the notice to proceed is actually on the town's website, so you can look at that. And then once the municipality has said, okay, we're done, we're sending it to you, we're making this formal application, CZM and DEP conduct the state's approval process and issue a written decision. So you are going to get, at some point, copies of all of this. The photocopier in the other room is working very quickly. But just to let you know, this is the planning process to date. I understand you can't read it from there, but let me tell you that what the categories of that planning process have been. So there have been a number of meetings of the municipal boards and committees, including the Harbor Committee, which met throughout 2018 and to date in 2019. There have been a couple of informational meetings. So there was a State of the Harbor panel promoted by CSCR, at which Tim Davies, who's chair of the Harbor Committee, and I presented what was going on with this process. They also had other plans being presented, including your master plan. And then there was an open house in December 8th of last year that was also an informational meeting. It was held at the library for people to stop by on the regular hours. Then there have been 2 facilitated public workshops, one on May 31st and the other on December 17th of last year. May 31st, we introduced the planning process to everybody and went through the current existing conditions in the harbor and some initial visioning. In December, we then looked at how we would want to consider a conceptual plan for the harbor and got some input on that. That conceptual plan has made its way into the draft. There have also been a number of regulatory steps. So the whole notice to proceed was a series of regulatory steps which was submitted to CZM on September 25th of last year. So in between the 2 meetings, May gave us the ability to refine the scope. And that what happened with that is that you don't just submit it to CZM, you also have to submit it to every possible agency or authority that has an interest in the harbor. So in September of last year, when this was submitted, the town also submitted it to all the other agencies, state agencies. It was published in the Cohasset Mariner on October 5th of last year, published in the Environmental Monitor on October 10th, distributed to an extensive Harbor Committee mailing list that same month. And then there was a public comment period that ended in November 9th of last year. And then CZM issued the notice to proceed on December 7th. So then the second public meeting took place after that. And then we moved to doing, after the public meeting in December, we moved to the January draft. There was public comment on that. There's also been an April draft, which was deliberately timed to happen just before town meeting and take into account the zoning process, about which more in a minute, a July draft, and the September draft, which is the current one on the website. Parallel to the municipal harbor planning process, and this is where things get a little complex, is that there was a proposal about, I'd say late spring, early summer last year. We at least, I think other people may have been aware of it earlier, became aware that the Cohasset Harbor and Atlantica, there was a proposal for some a change of ownership and changes of use there. And so that was something that was starting to feed into our process, is as we understood what was going to happen in the harbor, that initial proposal became a piece of how do we figure out what's going on with that and what the impact of the harbor is. And then, as I think many of you know, the ownership changed partway, or the proposed ownership changed, and the proposed plans changed again during that process. So that leads us to a second parallel process that was going on at the same time. So if you imagine over here is the municipal harbor planning process, over here is the zoning process. So once the January draft came out, at the same time, the town hired us to start writing the zoning that could accomplish what seemed to be the goals of the community and of the development team and the public interest of what could happen on that site. So what we did is we looked back and said, okay, what has the harbor plan come forward with so far that would be critical if you looked at how to change the zoning on this site, and are there other sites in the area that would make a difference? So as we thought about the goals of the harbor plan, that fed into the zoning. I'm going to go through some of those goals in a little bit. And then that zoning process continued to the town meeting, at which point it was approved by town meeting. Then we were able to incorporate that approval back into the July draft and continue in the September draft. So that's how those two processes, the harbor, the zoning, and then back to the harbor, work together. So there's been committee reviews of the draft since April, July, and September with the ability to have public input. We've also met with the Board of Selectmen on September 24th and the Planning Board quite recently on November 6th, and some of which you'll hear presented today comes out of those two meetings. And then finally, this is today's informational meeting. Now there's a remaining process to go through. The first is the local approval process. That would require a meeting with the Harbor Committee to basically say, okay, we're good with the draft. a Board of Selectmen public hearing. And that public hearing, the Board of Selectmen would take a vote to send this to CZM. It's basically an application to CZM, which kicks off the state process. Before this happens, CZM has asked to take another look at the plan. They gave us extensive comments on, I think, the April draft, but they want to see it again, so we would do that. Harbor Committee meeting, Board of Selectmen meeting, any final edits, because it's not a final plan and, in terms of the local approval process until after the Board of Selectmen have voted it. It gets submitted to CZM. Then those same agencies that I mentioned all get a copy of it. It gets published in the Cohasset Mariner, that it is available, published in the Environmental Monitor, again by CZM. CZM has a public comment period, as they did with the notice to proceed, and they will hold a local public hearing, meaning that CZM will come to Cohasset and hold a public hearing, and then they will consult with the municipality and that would include the Harbor Committee. This is where they come in as a harbor planning group, as their official role is to consult with CZM during this stage as well. And then a CZM, after the close of the public comment period, assuming they have no more questions, will issue a written decision to the town. It's at that point that the plan becomes final. So it's important to note that during the public comment period that CZM is holding, they can ask for further information or clarification or request changes. So this meeting is certainly not the last point at which people will have a voice. So I'm going to move on to the plan itself. Let me just grab the cover. So this is what it looks like. It is, as I said, on the town's website, and it should be the one you're looking at should be marked the September 2019 draft. And it's broken into a number of different areas. Although there are certain items that are required by the state, you have some flexibility in how you present that information. So there's an overview, a discussion of the general planning area, at which point I'd have a lovely map up here, the vision for the harbor, and that vision came from a combination of the public workshops we held, work with the Harbor Committee, and also I interviewed a number of both department heads and organizations that have either responsibilities or take actions or have some sort of interest in the harbor. I learned a lot during those interviews, and so all of that worked into the vision. And then we start breaking it down into the components of the plan. So there's Cohasset Harbor itself, and within that we talk about the overall harbor, a little bit about the history and the governance of the harbor, and out of that come recommendations for harbor governance. We talk about the water sheet, and when we talk about the water sheet, we're talking about the surface of the water and also what's underneath. And so when you think about the surface of the water, thinking about boaters, both recreational and commercial, and swimmers and kayakers and fishermen and all of those people who have some sort of need for the surface of the water. Recommendations for water sheet actions come out of that. Then edges, and by edges we mean exactly where land and water meet. So in that case, we talk about hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure, or environmental. And the hard infrastructure will be your seawalls, it'll be your docks, your slips. The soft infrastructure are the tidal flats, the marsh, what's going on in terms of the natural ecosystem. Recommendations for the edges out of that. And in terms of land, it's actually broken into two pieces. There's the overall land of the land that is right along the water's edge and what's going on there and who's there. And so we talk about the different organizations that are there and what they're doing and what their needs are at the high level of the municipal harbor plan. And then we also talk about the land in terms of how you connect the harbor to the village. And this has been an ongoing discussion. It was part of the goals that the Harbor Committee originally set out for this process, is looking at what's going on in the village and what's going on in the harbor. How do you connect the two of them? And the obvious answer is, of course, Elm Street. But we're talking about just physical connections, but also economic and cultural connections as well, so that they really work together. And there's a series of recommendations that come out of that. And then there are the modifications to Chapter 91, and that's that piece I talked about earlier about what's coming out of this process that might require some modifications. And then we go into the implementation plan, which is how you're going to do all of the recommendations that come through. And in the implementation plan, we tie the recommendations to the initial goals of the planning process, and we talk about funding sources, potential funding sources, and we also link the recommendations together in ways that make sense. So for example, some of the recommendations are going to be construction projects, others are going to be studies. So where we see among the water sheet, the edges, the land, and in some cases the governance, we say these 5 or 6 recommendations could be done as a single study and a funding source is X. These recommendations could be done as a single study and the funding source is Y. These recommendations don't require a funding source, they require policy changes. So they're grouped in ways that make it easier to implement and easier to write grants for, which is really important. And then finally, we have a series of appendices. So we worked with our colleagues at FXM Associates to look at the economy and the market around the harbor. Their information has been included in the overview, but is a full appendix as well for people who like to get into the details. Same thing with GEI Consultants. They did the physical overview and looking at the inventory of what's there now and the condition that it's in. We've extracted that into the plan, but there's also their full report in an appendix. Appendix C is a list of the Chapter 91 licenses. Those of you who own land and have done project in areas under Chapter 91 jurisdiction know that for certain actions you require either a license or a permit. We've been going through and pulling all of those licenses and extracting, or as many as we can find, and extracting them into Appendix C. Appendix D is the actual notice to proceed, and CZM requires a memorandum that says how well we followed the process. We said we were going to follow at the beginning, so there's a draft of that as well. And finally, Appendix E is the Harbor Village Overlay District. So the general planning area, not that you're going to be able to see it from here, but it is essentially about a parcel's depth and a road in away from the harbor itself. So you can see when you do get a copy of this map, and I know they're making this, that there's a red line on there, and that red line is the approximate Chapter 91 jurisdiction. We pulled that from the Mass GIS, Geographic Information System data. You can do it yourself if you go to Mass Oliver and play around with the layers. And so we've centered it on the water sheet of the harbor within the breakwater. So it's important for you all to know that this particular municipal harbor plan does not go beyond the breakwater in the in-depth study. It's the breakwater into include the Cove, Bailey Creek, sort of the edge of the Gulf. We don't go too far into the Gulf beyond the Border Street Bridge. So we're looking really that boundary of that line and the land that belongs to it. And in thinking about a vision for the harbor, what we came up with was this. The Cohasset Harbor is a jewel box of a harbor. The small area supports a variety of users: commercial fishermen, recreational boaters, sailors, rowers, scientists, dog walkers, coffee drinkers, diners, artisans, artists, residents, visitors, and those just hanging out and enjoying the beautiful sunrises, sunsets, and breezes off the water. The vision for this harbor is simply to enhance the land, the water, and the edge in between to support access to and enjoyment of the harbor for all ages, interests, and abilities. The key is to balance the needs of the variety of uses to ensure a safe and pleasant experience for all. Part of that enhancement is a strong link between the harbor and the village, a link with physical, visual, and economic components. And I do want to stress the idea of balance. This is not a big harbor. It is a beautiful harbor. It's certainly been a pleasure for myself and my colleagues as we come down to work in it. But there's a lot going on in it, and as we had discussions throughout the public meetings, the harbor committee meetings, and in talking with individual groups, there's some conflict there in terms of balancing the needs. Everybody is using the same spaces, and so we tried to call out where we could throughout the harbor areas that might require further study in terms of those needs. So in thinking about the implementation plan for that vision, it really is drawing the investment needed, the regulatory changes required, and any other actions that are needed to support the recommendations of this plan for infrastructure improvements for the goals of the harbor, modifications to Chapter 91, and those are included to address future development to strengthen the harbor in terms of its water, land, and edges. And this is important, the complex interweaving of both the ecosystems and the economic systems in this small area. Because in addition to the development that you have seen over the decades, beyond decades, centuries in this harbor, there has been that back and forth between economic development and ecosystems. And we recognize that that's been an area of concern for a lot of people. So in thinking of the plan components that I mentioned earlier, harbor governance really defines the entities that are responsible for the health of the harbor in all the different senses of the health and how those entities work together. Health is defined as social, environmental, and economic health. Watershed, as I mentioned before, is the activities on or under the surface of the water, and its components include commercial fishing, recreational boating, moorings, dredging, underwater ecosystems, and other related elements. Edges we talked about are the soft and hard infrastructure, the seawalls, docks, piers, and vegetative ecosystems that protect against wave and wind action or that allow anything that allows access between water and land. And then land allows access to the water, supports commercial and recreational activities, and provides the infrastructure to support those activities. So the components are buildings, parking, and the link to the villages. We've talked about the Chapter 91 modifications and the implementation plan before. So I want to just lead you into what the goals for the planning process were, because those very much link to how the recommendations came about. So this was provided to us by the Harbor Committee. It was modified slightly during our initial meetings. But these are the goals where, as we started working with the town, these were the things that they asked us to keep in mind. So support the Cohasset commercial fishing fleet, support public use of and access to the harbor, identify and plan for appropriate improvements to landside and waterside infrastructure, support public use of the harbor, including support for those town and civic organizations that enable such use, improve the geographical relationship between the village and the harbor, identify and improve commercial landside and waterside commercial activity, integrate and improve harbor management and uses, identify and address improvements to ecosystem and environmental issues, provide recommendations for a recurring dredging plan, areas, frequency, dredge type, potential funding sources, and finally, to provide an action plan and steps to implement the MHP recommendations, identifying responsible entities, timeline, and available funding mechanisms. And as you go through the implementation plan, you'll see how we broke those out. I would have a beautiful image to show you of what we did in May and in December of last year. But essentially in May, we kicked off with testing out some of those goals and objectives to see what the critical pieces were. And then after presenting the existing conditions of the harbor, we really asked, table by table, asked people to delve into confirm some of those existing conditions, both opportunities and constraints, and then start helping us work towards a vision. In December, we started to have a lot of the implementation actions at a high level and asked people to prioritize them. We also had a draft conceptual plan that called out what could happen where and asked people to respond to that. So in terms of the recommendations, for harbor governance, these were the following recommendations, and I'm going to give you the shortened version of these. It's in far more detail in the plan, but the first was to merge the responsibilities of the Government Island Advisory Committee into the Harbor Committee. We noticed that you had these two separate committees of the town working in the same area, and it seemed as we went through the municipal harbor plan that there was some overlap. Then review and modify the charge of the current Harbor Committee, because that had been focused on getting this plan done. There may be a change in the role after that. Consider the establishment of a Waterways Enterprise Fund. This is something that some other towns have. We don't have enough information from this high level of the planning process to say whether or not it's a good or a bad idea for Cohasset, but we felt it was an idea that should be explored further. Establish a Friends of the Cohasset Harbor as a charitable organization that could help support some of the recommendations in this plan. Document public safety responsibilities in the harbor, and a lot of this goes to, it's not that the public safety agencies themselves don't know what they do, because of course they do, and they all do a fine job working with police, fire, and of course the harbor master. It's to let the public know what they are so that people are aware of who does what. Establish an intermunicipal agreement with Scituate. I think you all know that the dividing line between Cohasset and Scituate goes straight down the harbor, and there have been questions that have come up over the years and will no doubt in the future about that. And then create and publish a written emergency response plan. As with the documenting the public safety responsibilities, that goes to public understanding of what that is. In terms of the water sheet recommendations, the commercial fishermen had presented a request in March of last year of the things that they needed. So we have a recommendation to address those requests. Conduct a mooring study. There was a lot of back and forth of can the harbor be organized differently? And to understand that, you would need a study. Evaluate a new pile-supported pier in the area that would add additional capacity. Conduct a dredging study. That goes back to one of the initial goals. Complete the Parker Avenue boat ramp. Frankly, that was an easy one because it was already in process, but it was important to note that that was going on as we were discussing it. And consider separating facilities for commercial fishing and recreational boating. As you can imagine, that got a lot of comments back and forth. Again, we don't know if that's something that's possible. It came up through the public discussions. It is something that would require additional study to see how and if that could work. In terms of the edges, you'll see in the report that we go quite a bit into the impacts of existing flooding conditions and naturally sea level rise. And this is a huge issue for all of our coastal communities. We provide rather a lot of information that GEI gave us and extracted that into the report itself. But in terms of the impact of sea level rise on the harbor, it actually extends much deeper into Cohasset than you might think. And that's because of all the beautiful marshlands, the Gulf River, the James Brook, all of these waterways that are flowing into the harbor. Water can flow back in the other direction. So we have some maps in the plan on that. But what we're recommending is that the town undertake a hazard mitigation plan. Now, you've done a municipal vulnerability planning process already, which identified the high level. We've extracted the pieces of that that are relevant for the harbor and put them into the plan. But a hazard mitigation plan would go into much more depth than either the MVP process, which is a fairly short, very high level process, or the harbor plan could do. We suggest conducting a study of the breakwater. We've heard concerns from a number of people about that. Evaluating and repairing the seawalls. Evaluating the health of the soft infrastructure. And as we were told, it's not so much that you need to do anything to the soft infrastructure. The environmental ecosystem works well, is what we've heard, but it's establishing the baseline. What is it doing now, and how do you measure that change over time? Creating an educational program about all of these issues. Considering a hydrological model of the harbor. So the sea level rise information that we looked at basically says it'll go up, X number of feet in Y number of years, and nobody can fully answer that yet. A hydrological model shows where the water goes. Adopting the regulatory changes, which works into what we've been talking about today. Considering incentives for developing energy efficient and sustainably efficient building structures, evaluating the overall infrastructure in the area, and this was meant to include streets as well as the edges, and reducing the impact of heat island effect, and this primarily comes down to Elm Street. I walked from the village to the harbor on a beautifully sunny day in April, and it was roasting. And so in terms of thinking about making the village to the harbor an attractive destination, There needs, in addition to some potential streetscape changes, there needs to be more trees on there. It was a fine walk in April. I enjoyed it. It would be very, very difficult, I think, for people who are more vulnerable to heat effects in July or August. In terms of the land recommendations, studying Government Island was a key, and that's because there are so many uses on Government Island in such tight quarters, and they all want to do more and wonderfully exciting things, but they can't, figuring out that balance is difficult. In addition to that, evaluating the need for more parking just throughout the harbor area and how that can be accommodating. Thinking about streetscape improvements, Elm Street to Border Street, and figuring out how you can make the walking environment more comfortable. The painted line along Border Street is very tricky with people parking over it. And then we talked a lot about signage, just informational signage, telling people about the history and the environment of the area, and directional signage. How do you get from the village to the harbor? How do you get from the harbor to the village? How do people know where they're going and what they're doing? Evaluating zoning changes to the light industry zone, which is just a tiny little piece of the harbor. It's the only piece of the light industry zone in there. That was a little bit outside of the scope of this particular discussion, but we feel over time. Establishing gateways so you know when you've entered the harbor area. Developing a marketing plan so that people beyond Cohasset know about the village and the harbor and how they're connected. So we envisioned it as a joint plan among the two areas. And then one thing that came out of the public process, and we've put it into the draft because we think it's an interesting idea, is creating special permits for young business owners. We felt in talking to a lot of the organizations, we heard how many young people were involved in the harbor already. There was one or two people who said, hey, you know, wouldn't it be nice if kids could do something? And by kids, we never formally established the age range, but I think it's an 18 to 25, so I apologize to the 25-year-olds for saying kids. But establishing something to make seasonal businesses a little bit easier to run. So that takes us through the key recommendations. Where I wanted to be now was to talk to you and show you some visuals on the Chapter 91 amplifications, substitutions, and offsets. And the key piece of this at this point, the vast majority of what we saw in the harbor doesn't require any change to Chapter 91. However, the town meeting has passed a new zoning overlay. And the key piece as we see it is ensuring that the application of Chapter 91 on the parcels within that overlay is consistent with the Harbor Village Business Overlay District. And what we have to show you is an analysis of how the zoning overlay works and how the business district and how the Chapter 91 works with that. So if you don't mind, I'm going to take a sip of tea, check in on that computer, and then come back to you. All right, so the good news is we have a projector, so I can show you the images. We'll just take a minute or two to set it up. So while they're doing that, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the purpose of the Harbor Village Business Overlay District, or the HVBOD. If you don't mind, I'm just going to call it the Overlay District because it's a little bit easier. So the Overlay District had four purposes. Those of you who are town meeting members will probably already be familiar with these. To encourage a vibrant mix of uses, including multifamily residential, to support increased public access to and commercial activity within Cohasset Harbor, to activate the edges of Border Street and Summer Street and the Cohasset waterfront, allowing commercial uses to contribute to public activity in the area, encourage physical and commercial links between Cohasset Harbor and Cohasset Village, anchoring Elm Street at each end with a complementary mix of commercial and residential uses, and ensure that new development in the harbor area is consistent with a local and state-approved municipal Cohasset Harbor Plan, including the requirements for public access under Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 91. So you can see, I think, just from the statements of the purposes that as we prepared the draft zoning for discussion, first by the Planning Board over a series of 4 public hearings, and then by the town meeting itself, that the goals of the harbor plan in relation to these parcels were very much on our mind. And in particular, there are a couple of things that we wanted to ensure got into the zoning as public benefits. One of those was something that came out of the harbor plan, which was a consistent harbor-wide walkway that stretched from Town Landing on Margin Street all the way around to Government Island. And when you look at that, the parcel that the Cohasset Inn site is on now, the Cohasset Inn is on, is a critical piece of that, right? You can't make that loop without being able to walk along the water there, which you, of course, can't do now. So the idea of that harbor-wide walkway was important. The other piece that we wanted to make absolutely sure got into the zoning was the idea of a view shed or view corridor from Elm Street to the harbor. And this is important as we thought about the physical connections. I don't know how many of you have walked from the village to the harbor, or if you think about driving slowly there, you don't know there's a harbor there if you go along Elm Street. So figuring out how that site could be designed to allow it to be viewed from as you approach the harbor from Elm Street and from the village. So the idea that having a draw when planners talk about walkability and all, the idea that you have a draw, that you have a destination, so that from the village, which has active commercial uses, to the harbor, which has very much active institutional uses, but is less, the activity is less apparent to a visitor, creating some sort of commercial anchor. And so that's why you get the village business Harbor Village Business Overlay District. It's almost, how do you create a village at the harbor that supports or is linked to the existing village already. All right, if you put that little nub in here, did you? Hang on. Oh, look at that. Okay, this is all the stuff you would have seen. Okay, so here I will stop and show you. So here's the general planning area. You can see this red line here. That's the approximate Chapter 91 boundary based on Mass GIS. I should say that if you own property in this area and you're thinking of doing anything about it, please get a surveyor. Please look at your previous Chapter 91 licenses, if any, for your property. Don't rely on Mass GIS. That's really important. But I want to show the sort of the extent of the planning area here. And then we're going to jump through all the stuff that I read to you. So just this is the work that we did in May and the work that we did in December, and read all of that. So here is the Harbor Village Business Overlay District. So you see it's got the Cohasset Inn site. We cross the street and capture some parcels here, and then this is Elm Street, Border Street coming down this way, Government Island, just to get you, this is Atlantica here. Here's the Mill River. All right. Now we're going to start. So what we did is to show how Chapter 91 and the zoning interact with each other. We use the existing Cohasset Inn site because that has both the zoning and Chapter 91. So this is the existing building here. You see the property line is this red line. Follow that through. Here it is in a plan, and you'll also see section here. So the property line, the seawall, which becomes important, and the property line again. And what we did was we took our section straight through the middle of the site all the way through, so that should orient you all. So in terms of the zoning, what you see here is not a building. I want to make that very, very clear. So please, nobody panic about that being a building. That's the building envelope. So what we did is we're applying the setback and other restrictions of the zoning to say that a building can fit on this site anywhere within this envelope. And so what you see here in this orange, so it's limited to 35 feet above base flood elevation. You see 2 stories here, and then the third story, if there is a third story, must be set back from a public way. And since the 25-foot no-build setback would also have the public walkway as required by Chapter 91, this is a public way. Elm and Margin Street are a public way, and Summer Street down here to Border Street, all public ways. You get the setback all the way through in the building envelope. That's why it looks like that. So again, you can see this in plan. Your dotted line here is your third-story setback, 10-foot setback from the public way. This here is the 25-foot no-build setback from the shoreline. And then you see the seawall, and the property line actually goes to the water side of the seawall. So in thinking about the zoning requirements in terms of use, there is a requirement to activate the street and the water side with retail for the not retail, active uses. So for the purpose of this diagram, we're using a 60-foot deep red area. It's not to say that whoever develops this property has to put 60 feet of active use on both sides. It's to set up the test dimension, and you'll see why that is in a minute. The other thing that the zoning allows is residential and non-public parking on the ground floor. And this is where the potential conflict with Chapter 91 comes in, because in certain zones of Chapter 91, which we're going to go through in detail, you can't have these private uses on the ground plane of the land. And so the question becomes, is there a point at which the ability to, under zoning, put a residential use and a private parking use comes into play that is in conflict with Chapter 91's requirement for public uses? So we'd be looking at that, and then you can see the residential and the step back from residential here. So now we're going to go through the different pieces of Chapter 91. This is, apologies to anybody from CZM or DEP in the room. We've tried to simplify this as much as possible. This is the first zone to think about, and this is the line of Chapter 91 jurisdiction. And so this is we could go into great detail about what that means, but let's just, for the purposes, this is what CZM and DEP have control over. So somebody building on this site that goes in for their Chapter 91 license, DEP is going to be looking at what happens within this jurisdiction to make sure it's consistent with Chapter 91. Now, the second zone you want to think about is the water-dependent use zone. And this is a tricky zone to calculate. It is a minimum of 25 feet away from the shoreline, which is actually why we have that 25-foot no-build buffer put into the zoning. But the extent of it varies based on parcel depth. It is an average of the parcel depth. And now you can see why this site is so tricky, because if this were a square or a rectangle, this would be an easy discussion, but it's not. And so how you determine this yellow line depends on which lines you take from the project shoreline, the seawall, to determine what the average depth of the parcel is. So we took one set of ways of calculating that. Somebody else who is doing this might take a slightly different way. That calculation would go to CZM for their review and approval. Also note that there's some yellow line here that's not colored in. That's because it doesn't apply outside of the Chapter 91 jurisdiction. So what you're seeing here is the water-dependent use zone within Chapter 91 jurisdiction. It's outside, it doesn't apply. And what that means is within the water-dependent use zone, you have to have water-dependent uses. And those are outlined in the regulations for Chapter 91 as to what suitable ones are. But basically, the idea is you are privileging the use of that area for the ability to access or use the water. The third and final zone we want to think about is the facilities for public accommodation. This is a little bit easier. It's 100 feet away from the project shoreline. That's your green line there, but is also limited by the Chapter 91 jurisdiction. And as you would expect, it overlaps the water-dependent use zone. So the facilities of public accommodation is deeper than the water-dependent use zone, but overlaps it in the relevant area. This is important because what Chapter 91 says is that this area is reserved at the ground floor level for uses that the public can access on a regular basis. So retail and restaurant are obvious uses there, gallery space, institutional space for public education, yoga classes by the water, anything that the public can access on a regular basis. What's not allowed are private offices or residential that the public cannot access on a regular basis. So now we're going to want to know in this area here, are we starting to overlap those areas where we thought we might be able to allow residential or non-public parking uses? And so that's what this next step does. So here is the water-dependent use zone. I should say, you see it going up here. Chapter 91 allows a maximum height of 55 feet. After 100 feet, you get to step up as you step back, but we're not worried about that because the zoning only allows 35 feet above base flood elevation. So the zoning, as the more restrictive, actually governs the height, but that's why there's a difference. So here is at the center of the site, this is the Chapter 91 jurisdiction. Obviously, if we'd taken the line up here, it would be a little bit deeper. If we'd taken the line there, it would be a little bit deeper, but that's about right. You'll see that it's not moving into our 60-foot active use depth here, which means it's not moving into sort of the residential parking area. So taking the exercise all the way through from the seawall, which is the project shoreline, this is the water-dependent use zone. Still has that 25-foot no-build buffer there. And this is the facilities of public accommodation zone. So again, what we're seeing from this test is that we don't need to worry in this particular section about the residential parking. Now, if the building were going to come here or here, we might need to, in which case we might want to modify Chapter 91. So the other thing that we wanted to do is say, okay, that's great, it's nice to have that diagram. Is it possible to get a building volume roughly equivalent to the building volume that's on the site now, so approximately 50,000 square feet? Can you do that without overlapping into any of the Chapter 91 jurisdiction? And the answer is yes. It's a box. It's not the best development that could happen on the site, but it is possible to develop something on the site that doesn't go into the Chapter 91 jurisdiction. And that is including, and if you see this space here with that funny little triangle, this is, you see the red line, that's still the property line. But what we've done there is we did actually 3 separate tests of view sheds, of the view corridors, to see the type of building envelope you could get depending on where the view corridor was. Now, that is not to say, that is not to say that that is the exact view corridor that would happen. That's why we did 3 tests, but it let us know that you could get the approximate volume on the site without going into Chapter 91. However, that's not necessarily a building that is going to be something the planning board is going to want to support, or even that a developer would want or that the town would want. So then the question becomes, is there a way that we can consider giving additional flexibility on the Chapter 91 regulations to allow a different type of building that might encroach upon these areas? So that was our final step, is what modifications need to happen to Chapter 91. Chapter 91 allows amplifications, which means you look at the requirements of Chapter 91 and make them stricter. They allow substitutions, which means you look at the Chapter 91 regulations and say, we'd like something else, usually something that's less restrictive. In exchange for a substitution, you need an offset. And the offset is what protects the public's right to the access to the water. So we're proposing, after the planning board meeting that we had on November 6th and discussion with the members of the planning board, we're proposing 3 amplifications. And those amplifications would essentially make Chapter 91 consistent with the zoning that has already been passed for the site. So we're suggesting that we reduce the allowable height to 35 feet above base flood elevation. What that means is that Chapter 91 and the zoning will no longer be inconsistent with each other. The regulations in the zoning will govern. We're suggesting that we require that 25-foot non-buildable setback from the project shoreline as an amplification. So again, that is consistent with what is already in the zoning. And that we require the view corridor aligned with the southern edge of Elm Street that comes directly out of the zoning. consistent with an approved special permit from the town of Cohasset Planning Board, so that when the developer of the site goes in for their Chapter 91 license, they can say, we have an approval from the town of Cohasset's Planning Board for the view corridor, here's what it is. Now, we did that because, in just looking at the 3 variations we came up with, we knew there were more. CZM may come back and say, look, we want that tighter, we want it to be a square footage. We won't know till they look at it. We're proposing one substitution, and this substitution would allow for that flexibility I mentioned earlier. And it would allow up to approximately, and notice we have XX does not mean 20, just means that I need a number there, square feet of interior and exterior non-water dependent facilities of private tenancy will be allowed to be located within 100 feet of the project shoreline, so in that facilities of public accommodation zone, but not less than 25 feet from the project shoreline. So in going back very briefly to our piece, we are saying that, actually it's probably easier here, we're saying that we'll allow some facilities of private tenancy, in other words, the parking and the residential, in this area with the offset requirement that they have to provide a equal amount elsewhere on the site within the same building or within the space on the site. So what we're saying is it's fine if you move, say you put some residential here, but then you have to replicate that same piece here or over here, so that the public interest is not losing that number of square feet. So there's precedence for this, just to make sure. The East Boston Waterfront District Municipal Harbor Plan, which was amended to include 2 specific properties with the substitutions, offsets, and for those 2 specific properties, one of them has a very similar substitution on offset. So we know that CZM has approved that in the past. And this is a regulatory requirement. So 310 CMR 9.513B, it's saying that the department may allow any portion of the equivalent area of a facility of public accommodation to be relocated within the building footprint or in other buildings owned, controlled, or proposed development by the applicant within the development site. So we're using that as our model for this substitution and offset. And that is what I have for you. So assuming that everybody is on board with this and that we can get a number for that, we would be taking this back, we would make the modifications to the September draft, we would be taking it back to the Harbor Committee, to the Board of Selectmen, and then onward to the state approval process. I thank you for your patience. I'm sorry that the technology didn't work quite the way it should, but I appreciate your patience. Thank you.
Okay, that concludes the presentation part of the program as I had outlined earlier. And now what we'd like to do, and we're very interested in accommodating, is any public questions and commentary that'll help the Board of Selectmen as well as the planners to complete this project. So we want to be able to entertain anything that anybody who wants to ask questions and needs any further clarifications, or if you want to make brief commentaries, it'll be helpful. That's the purpose of this portion. And what we'll do is, if you would please raise your hand, and when you raise your hand, I'll recognize you, and then you speak only from up here. That way, not only can the whole room hear you, but the people on television, and this whole event is being filmed, so people in future posterity can also view it. So that's the reason for that process, and we're glad to stay here and listen to everything and anything the public has to say, because that's what we're all about as a community. So with that, I'll await the arising of any hands. And I see one gentleman there. Would you please come on up?
Fran Collins, 404 South Main Street. We've certainly been to more than several meetings on this issue, and it's sort of going on and on and on, and I'm wondering when we might put this forward to the coastal zone management people so we can let them have a look at it, and then they can come back and we'll have a chance to massage it a little bit more. But it seems to me that it's about time to move forward, isn't it?
Well, we want to move forward as soon as expeditiously as we could,
So
so
when
to
do you think
say.
that might be?
So do you want to take a crack at that, or I can, or what? We're gonna, well,
I thought she was going to take it for me. So once I make the final modifications to the draft, it goes to CZM. They've requested one more review before it goes to the Harbor Committee. After that, Harbor Committee, Board of Selectmen. So I think I said ish at the planning board meeting on November 6th. I would expect we'd probably get comments back from CZM mid to late December, and then back to the Harbor Committee and the Board of Selectmen in January. But having said that, CZM does have many other things on their plate, so I don't want to put them on the spot. Assuming that the CZM is going to do an informal review. And then I would assume, again, assuming everything is fine from their informal review, Harbor Committee and Board of Selectmen potentially in January.
and then it would go on.
Yeah.
So to clarify on that is, the Board of Selectmen want to do proper diligence, which is proper for a procedure like this. It's protective of the whole town, and it's just the proper way to do it, so. And we're gonna finalize this more clearly tomorrow night, but what we're essentially looking for or what we must have is that the Harbor Committee, once they review what their final proposal is, because we have commissioned them, chartered them with the responsibility of producing this plan and then presenting it to us with their recommendation. So at some point, as Emily had described, they will get what they consider, they'll get and review what they would consider to be their final plan and their recommendation. So they need to deliberate on that in public, which again is good for everybody, and they'll vote on it. And at that time, we would anticipate that they, and probably their chair at least, or they will then come to the Board of Selectmen, and we'll move as fast as this is ready, because we are eager to get this done. And they'll will then come to us, and they'll present then to us their final their recommendation as to what the harbor plan would be, and they'll give us the vote of their committee, 6-2, 3-4, 7-0, whatever, and the recommendation. We then have that. What we then are going to do is we're going to take that and send it to planning, because at the end of the day, the planning committee, the planning board is going to have to live with this and make decisions on it. So we're going to send it to planning and ask them to review it and give us their recommendation and vote on it. Similar to what we do with warrant articles, we send it to advisory, as you know, or capital if it's appropriate, and we get their input. So we definitely want the recommendation of the planning board. And in addition, we're going to send it to our town council, who will then, focusing mainly on the Chapter 91 regulations, which is the items that have been the most, have required the most deliberation. Is what's caused this to be not as fast as we all would like it to be. But anyways, that's all. We're gonna ask the town council, our town council, to review that and give us. We've commissioned him, who happens to be a him. It's Paul Durensis, to give us a 5 to 6, 7-page report that an 8th grader could read. That's the way we've sort of phrased it, clear report for us to understand exactly what those regulations say. So at that point, we're going to take those recommendations. We will also have the Harbor Committee's report and recommendation. That looks fine to us. I believe either by law, or at least we've set it up, we're going to go in, I think by law, we actually have to go in another public meeting. So then we'll get together in an evening like this, and that report that the public will see will be essentially with the same people presenting it, but it'll be one in which we are in general agreement with, and we won't have formally voted on it, but it's essentially what we're putting out as to where we want to make it. We may or may not have made changes to that report before it gets to that stage. That's part of our deliberation, and that's part of our obligation. So we may make commentary and reports, for example, on that square footage. If it says 100, we may say we want 80, if we want 120, or whatever. But what you'll see that evening will be what looks to us as what we're favorable towards. And at the end of that, we'll probably decide, and we're gonna, whether we vote that night, we may decide, or we may, if we've gotten a lot of input and commentary, or things are still don't look settled, we may think about it, and then at our very next meeting, make a vote of it. And then once we make a vote of it, assumingly we've recommended it, it'll then go to the state according to it. So that's what we're doing, and it seems like fairly thorough due diligence to us. It won't take a huge amount of time to do that. We're pretty much prepared to move as soon as we do get this report. So that's what we're doing, and we're doing it in order to be very thorough on behalf of the community, and to also give plenty of opportunity for public input, so that when this is all said and done, it's a community project. And we take that responsibility very seriously, particularly in an area like the harbor, because that's our crown jewel of our community. The harbor and the commons is our secular, sacred ground, so we want to make sure we do that properly. And so that's the way the process will be, and we're interested in proceeding forward with it. Okay? Does that, where did he go? He disappeared. Does that answer your question? I wouldn't think what I just described would take several months. I wouldn't think that would take, I don't know what the state is going to do with it, but as far as our diligent, what we're requiring, once we get it, we're going to move, fairly expeditiously. It wouldn't take several months. I would imagine we're talking weeks, and we do want to, we want to move this along. We've had our 2 other major reports done and approved. We'd like to get this done, and Emily and Lauren and our planning department and professionals and our committees have worked very hard on this, and we very much appreciate that. But we, this is what you have us here for, is to do our job properly, and this is not an easy assignment, but we take it seriously. So weeks, I would say, not months, to answer your question more concisely. Okay, if they're done on that question, who's next there? Just as Fran had done it, when these people speak, identify yourself, who you are, your address, and so forth. So,
Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Grady. I just have a question. When are we going to see hard plans of all these proposals that are supposed to be made and approved by CZM and all that? That's what I'm just wondering about. Hard plans, concrete drawings, blueprints, that kind of thing. And that's just a question. So before we send something to the cleanser, I think we ought to get it dirty first and see what we have in front of us.
all right. So by plans, do you mean what you're essentially interested in?
Architectural renderings.
But of where, though? This is where we're talking
Harbor area, exactly what it's going to look like.
the entire harbor.
Is whatever the plan is encompassing.
All right. Okay. That one, I'm definitely going to punt that one.
Buildings,
Yeah.
new designs, it'd be nice to see.
Nope, I know what you mean. And actually, that's a very important question. It comes up very frequently. I mean, essentially, people want to know as much as they can in a visual sense, I believe, is what the question is. And it's come up a number of other times as to what, at the end of the day, things are going to concretely look like. So I'm going to let Emily, that's a very tough question. So I'm going to preface that, Emily, for you. And you're not going to, I would anticipate it's not going to be totally clear, because I don't know if we can at this point. But Emily.
I understand that people want to know what things will look like. This plan, if you think of a comprehensive plan as sort of being a 50,000-foot view, this plan is below that. But there's nothing in this plan that has a specific project. This is what property X will look like, because the properties are owned by different people. Some of them aren't going to change their properties. Some of them, as we've heard, may change their property. If they do, they're going to go through the local permitting process, so whether it's a site plan review, a special permit, or if it's a building as of right, obviously it goes through that. So that's where those plans would be seen. There's nothing proposed in here that would require the type of architectural elevations, 3D renderings, anything like that you have requested. And so that's what I have. But if you want to see what's envisioned in it, I urge you to go to the website where the September draft is. Barring that and a few minor changes we've heard over the last month and a half, is effectively complete.
Yes.
Tim Davis, 257 Atlantic Avenue. Just following up on Franny's question, just so we understand the timing of the process. the next step, as I understand it, is to go to CZM for their final, whatever they're going to do. Does the Board of Selectmen approve sending that to CZM today? Do you have any reason not to send it to CZM? Do you have any questions that have not been answered that would preclude us sending it to CZM?
Well, yeah, well, you just heard the deliberation process that I
I know,
described.
I know.
So let me give you a couple of things, though, just to get to your frustration. First of all, you see 4 of us. I wouldn't want to call a vote for it unless there were 5 of us here. But besides that, I can look right up there and I see 2 X's that are red that look pretty important as to what that square footage would be. So I myself would definitely want to see whether you're talking 10 square feet that would go into 91 territory or 1,000 square feet, as my doctor friend is just with me.
Kevin.
So there's no way I myself could give you a decision unless I saw that. But I think, and I see Emily nodding for the process that we just described, that I just described, is a matter of weeks, and we're not trying to give anybody a hard time up here. We have a responsibility to the community to make sure that what happens in that harbor is proper. And for a few weeks, we've laid out a deliberation process, which I just described. And when that process is done, we're going to do it. We're going to move along on it. We do have to get the plan presented. The plan has never been presented to us ready for us to vote
Kevin,
on.
it will not be presented to you until CZM comes back with their final approvals.
Well,
So
wait,
Can I just-
you're not going to be able to get that until they come back. That's part of the process.
Right.
My only question is, when will you allow it to go to CZM so that you can get their input?
Right, go ahead, Emily.
I was going to say, with respect, I think we're talking about 2 different CZM pieces. So CZM part number 1 is they have already given a full set of comments to one of the earlier drafts. They've asked, before it enters your approval process, to have a look at sort of the final draft, the process you outlined with going to the Harbor Committee and Planning Board and Board of Selectmen. They want to see a final draft before that happens. So I think that XX can probably be filled in within probably a couple of days,
Is
maximum.
there anything that is standing between now and the couple of days? Anything that you need, Emily, to send it to CZM?
I need to change all the different colors of the ink to black. I need to make 2 or 3 minor
I
edits. that
think you
mentioned before,
understand
and
where
that's
I'm
it.
going with this, but
Yeah.
please, don't hold this up. The Harbor Committee has been working for over 2 years. 90% of the time we've spent is on this harbor plan. Can I ask you, have you each read the harbor plan? Kevin, I asked you that, and you said yes. Jack, have you read the harbor plan, the whole harbor plan? Yes. Paul, have you?
Yeah.
Good. Well, then,
Yeah, we don't want to get into an interrogation here.
okay, no, I
So
just
let
wanted
me
to question whether you'd done when you talk about due diligence, I was just asking about your due diligence, whether you've done that diligence.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, yes, and you can be sure we will. And also, too, tomorrow night, we're going to lay out even more, we're going to discuss this again to make sure it's very clear to all 5 of us, to all of us, that what that plan will be, but it'll be pretty similar to what I just described. There is that little twist of when it goes to the state, and that it's a little, we'll just have to clarify that tomorrow night, because I assume when that's going to the state, it's not going to be with our final approval. And that the approval process and diligence that I talked about will probably be triggered when it comes back from the state. And that when it goes to the state somehow, that's not going to require a vote on us, I assume. Yeah. It's just
That's
an
just a
attempt,
draft
it's an
review,
attempt on
yeah.
based everything that you've gathered to do it together. So we'll essentially be waiting for that to come back from the state, or when it does, then it's going to go through the process that I described. And again, it's going to go as fast as we can go, but we're not going to go any faster than we need to go to make sure we've done the right job for this community. I can assure you of that. Okay, did we have someone else here? Yes, sir.
Matt Marr, 417 South Main Street. We're here for a public forum to talk about the last September draft of the municipal harbor plan. If, at the end of this night, there's no changes to the plan that's already in place, can we have a vote on it, and can the harbor committee vote to approve can it be sent to the Board of Selectmen for approval?
Tonight?
What I said was, if there are no changes to the plan that's before us right now,
Right.
if there's no changes to the approval, to the proposal that we have in front of us right now, do we need more forums, more public comment?
Well,
We do need one more form.
yeah, the law states that we,
The law says we have to have one more, yes.
After the approval?
no, so let me try it again, because that's okay.
That's what I thought you said. You said after the approval.
So, no,
it
this
has
is,
to go to another public forum.
Recommendations come back from the state.
good, turn your thing on.
This is before we go to the state. This is
No,
before,
so-
this is when, after it goes to you.
As of now, it goes with the final draft going back to the state with the modifications that, black ink, all the minor modifications that are there. Goes to CDM, it'll come back to us, it'll go to the planning board, go to the harbor committee will vote on it, go to the board of selectmen, we'll vote on it, and then it's approved, sent back to the state for their Commonwealth final confirmation that it's approved. Does that make sense?
Yes, and keep in mind, we're not, to be honest with you, we're not rubber stamps up here. So we're not gonna just take what ever comes at us and just say yes, because that isn't what is our responsibility. So we may look at that, and we may have modifications or changes we want at that point. I don't know what they might not be, but, so it's just a process. But we're prepared to move this along in a matter of weeks. I mean, we've been waiting ourselves for months to get this report. Let me just finish if I may. This report was due to us last May. So I think we've been reasonably patient at not, being too rude about saying, where the heck is it? And what happened was, from what I understand, is that it might have been gone along sooner, but somewhere in the summertime, as Emily, I think, said, and has occurred, the 91 changes to change state regulations have become involved in this process, and apparently just slowed it down. So, but we're not yelling and hollering and crying, complaining about it. We'd like it to move along, but apparently it slowed it down. But the process, as I described it, is what would be done. There's no way it would ever be done like tonight or anything. We haven't gotten the report from our council, and the other things haven't been filled in. So the way I described it, I think I had it, is roughly the way it's going to be, but we're going to also make that even clearer tomorrow night. I think Lauren may even going to be try to put that in writing for us tomorrow, or maybe not, but we're going to have that pretty clear, as we can.
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
But if there's no changes proposed in tonight's meeting, can the Harbor Committee elect to vote on approving the proposal?
Well,
And then submit it to you guys, and then you do with it with what you have, what you
Right.
have to do.
So from what I understand, go ahead, Paul.
I guess my biggest concern is if it goes to the state with the final recommendations and there are modifications from the state that are legal requirements, for example, we can do whatever we want and vote on it, but it's not legal. So we're going to have to wait for the state final draft to be certified or reviewed or ratified, whatever they might do, to present to the Harbor Committee here, to vote on it, bring it to us, we'll vote on it, yes or no, with any more modifications we might consider useful for the town. And then it would go to the state, and the state would give the final pass, the final recommendations. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I'm worried about if there are certain state requirements as we go forward with the final substitutions and all of the minor 91 modifications that are there, that the state says yes or no, and it comes back to us. If they say no, what do? We have to change it. So we need to have a final draft to go to the state, come back to us with verification saying, yes, this is okay. So that's, I think, the first hurdle.
I understand what you're saying, but it doesn't make sense.
Well, let's say we vote on the plan, goes to the state and they throw it out. What do? We have to start over again. So I
They're
don't
gonna
want that.
modify it. They're gonna modify it.
Correct.
Correct?
And we
then-
voted on
and then-
something.
Then it comes back to you, and then you vote on it. But we've already voted on it, so they might disagree with what we think is right. And
Then-
that's
then
fine, that's fine.
But then you'd have to
But-
vote on the final modifications that have been reviewed by the state. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. It's not legal.
Well, we don't, the Harbor Committee doesn't have any power. We're just recommending things. And
Correct.
what we've been studying we feel is, and what Emily's
I
been doing.
understand, but when
has
it comes to the Board of
has been
Selectmen.
awesome, and so we sort of know what we need to do.
Yes.
And
I'd like to have the state say, yes, it's okay, because if we decide to vote on it and confirm
Yeah,
it,
this is
then the
before-
state
this is
says no.
Before we even bring it to the state, that's what I'm talking about. Voting on it now, and then bring it to you, and then you bring it to the state, and then the state brings it back to you, and then you vote on it, right? Is that how it works?
That's what we're doing.
Yeah. But you won't let us vote on it.
You can
Till-
vote on it
till
if you
comes
like.
back, till it comes
The
back.
Harbor Committee can vote on it. We're not, that's not our committee.
There really isn't a complete plan to vote on tonight anyways, as we indicated. Those two, there's other stuff to be done. Mr. Durant, did you want to come up here, please?
Howdy, my name is Paul Dorensis. I heard that there was one substitution on the Chapter 91 piece, but the September 30th plan that I reviewed and that the board had has 6 substitutions. So essentially, there's a new section for the Chapter 91 I've never read, other than what I've heard here tonight. The board hasn't seen it. So the statements that are being made that we're all done, let's vote on it, no one has seen the new plan. There's going to be a new plan. These changes that I heard, we've got to produce a new plan. So there's going to be a November plan with a different Chapter 91. My question would be, has these changes that were mentioned, have they been actually voted by the planning board or the harbor committee? In other words, what brought about these changes?
Okay, Emily, do you want to take a shot at that?
Absolutely, I'd be delighted to answer that. So our first presentation of the zoning and Chapter 91 analysis that you saw tonight was at the planning board meeting on November 6th. And we knew that the Chapter 91 draft modifications that were in the September were proving problematic for any number of reasons. And we wanted to make sure that we being my team and I, fully understood the implications of the zoning and the Chapter 91 so we could make the best, simplest possible recommendations. So we presented that information to the planning board on November 6th. We discussed with them what they felt might be helpful. The development team were there and showed us a very, very conceptual plan of what might be possible on that site. As we reviewed that information, had that discussion with the planning board, we realized that the far more complex substitutions and offsets that were in the September draft could be narrowed down to this much simpler, only 4 items. And so that's what you saw today was that proposal. I need to put them in regulatory ease as opposed to the fairly simple language you saw tonight. And that's all that needs to be done. Then CZM has requested that they see those modifications, that new draft text. They have not reviewed the September ones because they knew that it was in flux. They see those, what will probably be a page and a half before the town votes on that. So that's what we're going to send them, is the September draft plus those modifications, a couple of other minor tweaks. They'll review that, and then we can bring their full comments back to you. The thing that we want to avoid, and this is true of any state and municipal sort of joint regulatory process, is you do not want the executive body of a community voting to send something to the state for approval and it coming back with significant changes from the state. It's fine if there's some technical information that the state requires, but you don't want to have to rewrite an entire report. So it's critical that CZM sees this before the Board of Selectmen vote to send the formal application. So that's where the new substitutions and amplifications came from. It was a planning board meeting on November 6th. We're putting them forward as draft for discussion tonight. Then we'll firm them up and send them to CZM for their review, comment, and hopefully nod that yes, this is okay to go forward.
But my question was, did the planning board actually vote to withdraw all those other 91 pieces, leaving what's here?
They don't need to withdraw the other 91 pieces. That was a draft that came out of conversations over the summer and analysis over the summer. The planning board, I completely understand and agree with why the Board of Selectmen is having the planning board review this, but under the state regulatory process, the planning board does not have an official role. It is, as with all the other drafts, simply out there for comment and discussion. They had comment and discussion, and this is the direction that I took to bring forward the draft for tonight's discussion.
So this draft, no one has voted on yet.
No, they wouldn't.
Okay, thank you.
No, and actually, it sounds like this latest draft is simplified from the September one, if I'm, in a very general sense, but that's the feeling I got at the planning board the other night.
And the reason nobody's voted is not because there's no reason to vote, it's because this is still in draft form.
Oh, right, and
This
we've
is an
discussed another,
evolving
yeah,
document.
I don't mean to
But
interrupt
yes,
you.
it is. But
We've
it's
discussed how the
absolutely
voting is gonna
simplified.
go, yeah, right,
exactly.
yeah.
The voting is all up to you.
Yeah.
These are iterative drafts that we're trying to put forward to make sure that the maximum number of people understand the components of this harbor plan.
And we're gonna look at it and make sure we understand it, and that's why we're having our council review it. That's why we wanna have planning, even though they're not required to. We have deference to that committee, and that's why we're doing that. And they have to live with it more than we do. One of the things that's made it a little awkward for us as selectmen, and select women, and select people, is that we're not used to being a regulatory board of this nature. We've had to learn to, fly an airplane at the same time as we've been placed in the cockpit. I mean, doing regulatory changes isn't something we ordinarily do. So that's, it's been a wonderful challenge for us, and we've learned a lot and met a lot of wonderful people along the way. And but I do see, as you have we described tonight, I think we're increasingly comfortable. We see the path forward to reach this, make our decisions, and we got great professionals helping us and great committees, and this will work out however it should, one way or the other. We're going to do good, mature deliberation for the community. Did I see a hand down here and then over here? Sir, do you want to? Mike, did you do?
Robin Lawrence on Beach Street. I have a question about public commentary. I'm quite surprised that the plan is not required to go to town meeting. And if not, why is it not required? Right now, we'll have an executive board or the leadership of the town making a total decision. I would hope that the town meeting would have some comments about that.
I think this is Mass General law, so it
It doesn't have to go to town meeting.
does not require to go to town meeting, no. Mass General law. It's in the legislature.
And for myself, that wouldn't be so bad. Wouldn't bother us, I don't think, as a group. We're doing our responsibility that has been given us, and we did not seek it, but we're gladly embracing it and enjoying the learning process. Okay. Does that answer your question, sir? Yes.
Hi, I'm Mike Dick, 27 Parker Ave. I'm here as an abutter on Parker Ave. I'm also a member of the advisory committee, and I'm the liaison from the advisory committee to the harbor committee. So, full disclosure, I have 5 questions, and I certainly don't want to run through all of them unless folks want me to.
We have the posture that we'll be here till midnight to ask any questions the public wants, so we're quite open to do that, yeah.
Okay.
So feel free.
So, one question relates to the Chapter 91 substitution, and the others relate to the harbor plan
So why don't you
itself.
just do one at a time, and we'll take them the best we can, okay? Is that
Okay, so, starting with the...
number one?
Number one, starting with the Chapter 91 substitution. Could you explain the necessity for the substitution, and what is the impact to the town and future decisions that the town may have to make regarding the overlay district?
Sounds like an Emily question to me.
I was looking right at it.
We're so glad to have you here tonight.
It is it's always a pleasure to be in Cohasset. So the reason for the substitution is to allow the additional flexibility for placing a building on what is a very irregular site with very complex jurisdictional lines. The only reason is to say that the zoning has allowed the ability to put certain uses on the ground floor which are not allowed under Chapter 91, and all we're saying is, yes, you can put them here within that zone of public use, but you have to replicate the public use elsewhere. Now, in terms of implications for anything else that the town needs to do, a couple of things that are important. Remember, this is not a town regulatory process. The special permit under the zoning is a purview of the planning board. The license for Chapter 91 is the purview of the state. So it's the state that makes the decision as to whether or not a project is in compliance with Chapter 91. All we're trying to do is to make sure that the zoning and the Chapter 91 are consistent so that you don't have a planning board, for example, granting a special permit, the person who holds that special permit going to the state for their license, and the state saying, you can't do that, you need to go back through the special permit process. That's what we're trying to avoid. The Chapter 91 regulations can be written. I mentioned that East Boston Municipal Harbor Plan. The Chapter 91 modifications can be written so that they are site-specific. That is absolutely acceptable under the state regulatory process, which means that that particular substitution can be written so that it is specific to that one parcel, in which case there are no other implications for any other parcel within the harbor area. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Good. That's now number 2, please.
Okay, so aside from Chapter 91, let's put that aside. Going back to the harbor plan itself, which has been many months in the making and a lot of thought going into it, I wonder if we still have some amendments to make to it regarding the commercial fishery and the commercial use of the harbor. So we have our traditional lobster fleet, which in the creation of the plan, we never anticipated any other commercial use of our facilities around the harbor. And we are now very much aware of another commercial fishery, shellfish fishery, which may additionally require support from our harbor. No one really knows how it will all shake out. My point being, should there not be something in the harbor plan that addresses other industries that right now are being discussed and could happen in the future? Again, thinking about long-term planning, long-term changes that we don't want to be caught short in the future.
Okay, so I'm going to take a crack at that first. Give you a break. So you're on the Harbor Committee.
I am not on the harbor committee.
You're a liaison?
I'm a liaison from the
So
advisory.
we've commissioned the Harbor Committee to come up and present this plan to us, which apparently is not fully complete anyways, nor have they voted on it. So it is within the purview of the Harbor Committee to make the decision that you just said. If when they look at this to approve it, I would not expect they're a rubber stamp either. I mean, I don't know what deliberations exactly they've gone through. I know they've had a number of meetings, but when they look at whatever is the final plan and so forth, if a member of the Harbor Committee or two says, well, I would like to have some consideration of what your question was, then that Harbor Committee should take that up and make their recommendation to us. That's all that needs to be done there.
Great, thank you.
3.
How can the plan be amended in the future? Or is it locked once it's been approved?
Emily.
It can be amended through going through the same process, not the same number of years, by the way, but the process of having a public hearing with the Board of Selectmen. Presumably there would have been some I would always recommend a public meeting before a public hearing, some sort of planning that goes into that public meeting, but the formal would be the public hearing and submission to CZM. And it can be approved within, we haven't, I think the life of the plan is likely to be 20 years. That's about right for a regulatory. But it can be modified before then by following the same process.
4,
And-
number 4.
and if I can just also mention, the key state input is the Chapter 91. The minor modifications for anything else is far less regulatory problem at the Commonwealth level than the local level. So that is a much quicker process. So if we decide to modify it, add some addendums, make any adjustment to it, far quicker than doing what is the Chapter 91, a real clear, definite regulatory change in the use of that property or those properties there. So the harbor plan itself, there's a lot of other things that are there which would involve not as involved process.
So to amplify on that, that's a good point, thank you, Paul. What was the harbor plan is attempting to accommodate is the changes to 91, the 91 changes. And harbor plans can be passed and brought forward that don't change 91 at all. Some towns, and a number of towns don't, as a matter of fact. If there wasn't the 91 changes that are being dealt with here, this harbor plan would have been approved a long time ago. It's the 91 changes that have essentially slowed the process down, and that's not I'm not mentioning that in a critical, that's just the way it's occurred. But we're trying to accommodate that and make the best decisions for everybody, for all entities and for the town. And that's, otherwise this plan would have been approved months ago when the other two were approved. Just to amplify, yeah.
Yeah, and I believe the Chapter 91 changes could be made in the future. So we could presumably pass this without the Chapter 91, and then when the developer comes forth with their whole plan to the planning board, then they can simply go to the state for Chapter 91 relief at that time, and that allows the harbor plan to go forth with all the other benefits for the rest of the community. And for the development plan, they can bring their program to the state for the 91 they need separately. Is that correct?
Not quite. If they're seeking relief under Chapter 91, that would be granted under a municipal harbor plan process. They wouldn't be able to go on their own to get such relief. They would have to have the municipal harbor plan approved. And by the way, approval of a municipal harbor plan confers benefits other than Chapter 91 in terms of property. But they can't just go and get relief from Chapter 91. It is the approval, the state-approved municipal harbor plan that is in response to the local desires that offers that relief from Chapter 91. Without that, they're just going for a Chapter 91 license, and they are bound by the current requirements of Chapter 91.
Oh, so what you're, I tried, but it didn't. Oh, now it does. So what you're saying is that there's nothing that's ever been approved in Massachusetts, any changes to Chapter 91 without a municipal harbor plan ever?
I'm saying that if the town wishes to modify Chapter 91 to be in compliance with local desires as expressed by the zoning, then that modification is through a municipal harbor plan. That's the purpose of a state-approved municipal harbor plan. So otherwise, the provisions of Chapter 91 apply. I couldn't answer to anywhere in the state of Massachusetts because I've not read all the licenses in the state of Massachusetts. But the process that is established by the state for modifying Chapter 91 according to local preferences is the municipal harbor planning process.
I understand that, and again, I asked you to clarify, and perhaps, I guess you've just told me you probably don't have the definitive answer, that a developer cannot go in a project and ask for relief from Chapter 91 without a municipal harbor plan?
No, the harbor plan, if it's
I know it allows that.
the harbor plan, when it's approved, the use of that facility or piece of property would have to go through that at the local level, which has been approved. The state would look at that as their guidelines for approving the 91 license. If there is none, then anyone who has a piece of property on 91 can go directly to the state without any ability of the local entity, the municipality, of giving local control of the given properties in any given harbor. So the approval of a harbor plan with the 91 modifications in there gives much more local control as opposed to usurping the authority at the Commonwealth level. Does that make sense?
Well, perhaps.
You done?
Yeah.
You all set? Question 4?
Question 4, and this This goes to the advisory committee membership that I hold.
It's fine by us.
Okay, with the expected approval of the harbor plan, what is the town obliged, if anything, to undertake? Studies, changes to our infrastructure, and really where I'm going is future costs that we on the advisory and also capital budget are trying to work out a 10-year capital plan to make sure that all of the major needs that the town faces can be balanced and prioritized. So I wonder if anything coming out of the harbor plan may also need to be anticipated as a cost that we are required to make.
I think I can answer that, and that is that the harbor plan is not going to produce requirements of the town. The harbor plan is going to be a vision for the community, and they can come up with whatever we all agree that vision is, and then that's where we'd like to go, and then as time goes on, it'll have to fit into our capital and other plans. So there'll be plenty of time for advisory and everybody else to scrutinize whatever concrete things come out of it. But right now, we're just getting the vision with the harbor plan.
All right, so I'll close with that softball. Thank you.
No, you got 5 questions. You got another one? You did it? It's okay. Mike, we answered all your questions. Yeah, okay, good. I will. Timothy, you just... Yep. Because of the audience and the future posterity that will be viewing this.
Thank you. Tim Davis. I just want to clarify, I'm actually on record as saying that this harbor plan provides suggestions for the future that may include between public, private, and nonprofit investment in the harbor between $50 and $100 million over the next 10 or so years. So there's a big number. Certainly our hope is that most of that will come from sources other than the town budget.
I would hope so, because I wouldn't be I wouldn't be providing an override suggestion to that, I can assure you. Okay, great. Any other questions or commentary? I see a hand up there, and then I see one to the left, okay? You first, then the other gentleman. Yep.
Doug McGregor, 7 Border Street, and my question is fairly specific, which might
Good.
be relief.
It
That's
is.
about relief. Specific to this, it's not up there anymore, the whole issue of this Chapter 91, the relief of this one line that goes through the property. Philosophically, I know there's the X's of how many square footage is going to get traded for this and that, but do you guys have any hesitation philosophically to allowing the developer to have more freedom on the property, to be able to build in this zone? As an abutter and someone who's going to look at this, I'm scared when they're forced to go into this, what would come out of this project, what it would look like if they're pushed back. So can you answer, philosophically, are you guys comfortable moving ahead with the Chapter 91 relief in general? Not the specific number of what it's going to be, but can you?
If I may, just speaking for the board,
Yeah.
as you can see by us having this open forum and all the numerous meetings that the harbor has had and the deliberations, we're all open to considering the whole thing. And 91 is definitely something that's being considered. Doesn't mean we're going to rubber stamp it and say, yes, this is what we'll agree, nor has the harbor committee itself voted on it. But I would think that, to speak with the board, we will be rational, reasonable, and do whatever we think is the best interest in the town. And if that meant modifications into the 91 zone, I'm sure any one of us would say, yes, we consider anything that was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
We don't have an arbitrary, oh, no, don't do it. No.
No, I know, because I know it's on there. I came here tonight to make sure that was kind of moving forward, because I have 20-something years of development experience myself, and I'm going to be looking at this property from my place on 7 Border the rest of my life. I fear what it would look like if it was forced into this little cookie cutter, arbitrary line, somewhat illogical, set by the state. I'm hoping you guys
Right.
keep it in the hands of the town and let it go to planning and let it go through the special permit of what this actually looks like, and not determined by some state line that's kind of crazy and is going to force everything in this weird little box. So
Right.
I'm looking for you guys to
Yeah, so,
support that
so,
you'll-
so one of the concerns when the original modifications came out, I think there were 6 total. It was a little bit too broad and a little bit too vague. These are clear. The thought process is the way that line kind of goes through that piece of property, and again, the state allows us to do it property by property even. It's zigzag. It looks almost like a cross-cut saw.
Yeah.
The thought process was try to make it smoother
Yeah.
because the original coastline was not smooth.
Right.
to make it smoother for a potential better design envelope at that piece of property, so that you don't have something shoehorned in which is not what you want for the town. To give a minor amount of flexibility, it's not a lot, it's, you know, it's gonna be a portion that's cut from the zigzag portion that are gonna be modified and given the offsets on either side. That was my thought, is to try to give flexibility enough without giving, you know, free rein, so that you have certain state requirements, certain town requirements, the height, the area, all the things that are there. Because if you go back, when these buildings were put in, and it doesn't just go for Cohasset, it goes for a lot of the harbors around New England. These buildings were put in probably, you know, 200 years ago, 100 years ago, long before all of these laws were put in for modifications of use of wetlands, use of waterfront properties and access. So when it came in, these grandfathered buildings, now if you want to modify it, you need to have these offsets and these modifications to try to fit a reasonable building within the reasonable zoning in a reasonable property line that makes it understandable that it's not just a, you know, a zigzag building that's put in.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at my house, it's offset because I couldn't get the offset for the,
Better building, yeah.
yeah, it's zigzag. So,
I came here tonight just to hear that you guys had, that was your mentality, to
Yeah.
both be flexible with
and
developers.
not to say just open up the, you know, any individual property for a wide open, because we have that problem in town, or
Yep.
somebody decides to tear down a building and they'll blast the ledge, and 6 stories below, there's a game room, and 4 stories up, and there's not a tree to be seen, so,
Yep.
well
No,
aware of that.
Yeah, and I know the guys have to jump through, whoever develops this has to jump through a lot more hoops, but I'm wanting to hear that there's flexibility, that's philosophically, you're okay with that.
Yeah.
It's gonna be
That's my view,
difficult.
yeah, I'm not speaking with the board,
Okay,
but that's
because
my
I've
view.
seen harbor projects which come out pretty, I won't throw anybody under the bus, you know, statewide, but when things have to conform to state rules, it's like FEMA lines that get drawn with some ambiguity or arbitrarily. It confines people in a way that I wouldn't want to see the project across from my house that had to fit that cookie cutter thing, this red square all being crammed together. So I'd like to see something where you allow them some flexibility, pending all the other hoops they have to jump through, of
Right.
course. So.
Good point, 1 second if you would,
Well,
because
and we
Carrie has a
want-
comment.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you making these comments because we all want to look at a buildings that are beautiful and fit aesthetically with the character of our town. So the reason why we're having forums like this is to hear your comments, and we are, I think, all in philosophical agreement with you on keeping it to fit the, you know, the Cohasset brand that we want it to fit. So thank you.
Well, no, and ironically, I don't see that we're not actually giving them something by letting them, I think it would almost be a requirement, like you must present something that doesn't cram into here, that will make sense, not
Right.
not conform to some, again, arbitrary, illogical line drawn by the state that makes no sense. I was afraid of looking across at something that looks like that, and I think it'd be terrible. So I appreciate your.
That's very helpful. If you could stand, because I think
Yeah.
Jack wants to say something.
By the way, I've had, when my office was in Boston, I was on a number of planning and zoning advisory commissions. I don't know if you've done work in Boston, you know, PZACs and impact advisory. So this is not, I'm not unfamiliar with this. One of the purposes, of course, is to make sure that whatever is built there accommodates the existing neighborhood and does not detract from that. I know that box that you're talking about, Emily said it's 55,000 square feet. I haven't read to know whether that is cast in stone, whether that developer can do that by right. And one of the things that, at least that I'm looking for, is to find out what can be done by right. Also, one of the reasons why we'd like to see a little bit more of what it actually is being built there before we approve is because if you approve a regulatory regime and you don't see exactly what's being built, you may find that they'll say, well, yes, that's what we proposed, but we found out we can do this. So I think it's important to protect the neighborhoods, your property, and the harbor, that we have a pretty good idea of what actually is going there before we vote on it. And so I agree with you 100%.
No, fair enough. I fall more in Tim's camp of let's move it along. It's been a lot of discussion. I've been coming to things since we had the round tables with the white pads back in May of 2018, coming to these meetings and sitting in the back. But I think so much has gone into this. I'm actually, as an buddy, you might want to hear, I'm excited about what they're trying to do. I know how many hoops, as a developer, what they're going to have to jump through. You guys have control. Keep it in the town control, allow flexibility, and move it along, because it's going to be something good, because I know you guys are doing a good job, so thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Okay, who's next? George?
George McGoldick, 107 Border Street, also one of the partners at Cohasset Harbor Partners. I have a 3-hour presentation.
Take a
Said
serious.
you're going to be here all night, so the red line is open late, though. We'll make sure they stay open.
You assume you'll be catering this then, huh?
I say we extend the liquor license to a 4 o'clock license.
At 4 a.m. Red line is open now, actually. So I'm going to be really quick. I'm going to address some of the things that came up tonight, but I think the best thing that I heard tonight was that we're taking what was a 100-page document that everyone pretty much felt good about for 94 of those pages for the last 6 months. And as those 6 pages, those 4 to 6 pages of the Chapter 91, which Chapter 91 means public access, that's really what got people nervous because it's complicated. It was very complicated. So I'm ecstatic to hear that we've gone from 6 pages to what should be probably 1 page, maybe 1.5 pages. So I'd like to ask the board if there's any reason why the board could not concurrently, once the numbers are finalized and Emily does her last draft of that 1 page, if the board can't concurrently send it to CZM for their informal review, not their final review, their informal review, which is that typical? I heard that's not very typical. That's not always typical, or?
They've requested it. They're the ones who have
It's not
final
always
approval.
typical.
I'm going with them.
It's not always typical.
So if they are asking for it, we want to be careful on that.
Exactly,
I also think though, that is what we're doing. That is going to go to CCM before it comes to us, so that is what
Correct.
you're asking, yeah.
It's going to go to CZM for their another informal review. They've already reviewed it at least once before. It's going to go back to them for another informal review, which should take 30 days, plus or minus, right? Plus or minus 30 days. Is there any reason why the board can't concurrently send it off? Because you talked about sending it to the Harbor Committee, the Planning Board. You talked previously about the Conservation Commission. You talked about having local council review it, and then the Board of Selectmen. So that's 5 more potential meetings.
Let me stop you if I may, because I want to make it clear. No, it's simpler than that. When it comes back from the state, it needs to go to the Harbor Committee, who are commissioned to review it, deliberate on it, vote on it. Then the Harbor Commission can come to us, and we're willing to meet as fast as anybody can
Okay.
bring this stuff to us. Let me, if I may finish.
No, I'm just,
Yeah. So then from the Harbor Committee, then it comes to us. Once it gets to us, we want planning to look at it and give us an evaluation and a vote is what we're going to ask. I don't think they have to by law, but we're going to ask that for the reasons that we said before. We have the Harbor View plan review and vote. We're sending it off to our council, who previously, I don't want to put him on the spot, said that with the 8 or 9 or 10 pages, he could produce something, what we want within a week, So if we're down to 2 pages, he may even be able to go faster, it sounds like. But again, let's see what it is. That'll go fairly quickly, though. Then with that report back to us, and then and with the Harbor Committee's report, and then the report from the planning, we'll then have everything that we need to more or less look at each other and say, this looks pretty good. Let's do the final public review that's required by law. We will then have that public thing that'll be similar to us as quickly as we can. We're not delaying this, we're not delaying this. And we'll have that meeting, and then at that meeting, we'll look at each other and say, well, do we want to vote that night, or however, whatever we have heard, do we want to wait until probably the next selectmen's meeting and do it? So we're moving as quickly as we can. But keep in mind, though, I will say again, we're not a rubber stamp, though. Once we even get back from the state, even if the state has said that looks fine, we may look at that and say, well, from what we can reason publicly, we want to really have something a little differently. Chances are it would be something the state may be agreeable to, but, we're going to do our work up here and our job on it, but we can move fairly quickly on it, I think.
okay, but again, you just said it's going to 4 other committees. So I'm just saying, that can be done concurrently when it goes to CZM, because unless CZM makes major changes, and even if they do, you're not asking for a vote. But there's no reason to wait for CZM to give it to the planning board, to give it to the Harbor Committee, to give it to council to review it.
Okay, I'm gonna try this again because
That-
the CCM isn't.
It's my suggestion.
No,
you
no,
can
no,
take
no,
it
no, let
and
me
go to-
just finish. CCM is not giving it to the planning board.
No, no, no.
CCM
We're-
brings it back, and then the key trigger for us is we need to have the deliberation and vote and report to us from our committee, the Harbor Committee.
Right.
Once we get that, we're gonna move through the process that I've described 3 times, I think, but we are gonna stick to our process.
So through the chair, can I ask the Harbor Committee, can they take, it's not a vote to approve, it's a recommendation. So is there any reason why you wouldn't make a recommendation, subject to whatever CZM might make changes?
I've been advised by our town planner that I should wait until we have the recommendation, any recommendation modification from CCM. Is that correct? Is that what we're waiting for?
The other thing, I was hoping that this forum tonight would be very productive in discussion, which it has been, so thank you all. And I mean, I'm prepared with Emily and her, whatever the next draft will be ready to submit to CZM and distribute to the various boards and committees. But up until tonight, I did not want anybody taking a vote on a plan that may subsequently be changed to only further frustration in a process that some people have felt is not moving as fast as we would like. But I wanted to make sure we had tonight done, and then I would be happy to provide, as Kevin asked earlier, for a tentative timeline updating with some dates to move this to completion.
Okay, because on your timeline that you distributed in August, once it goes for the Board of Selectmen final vote, there's still almost 4 months. 4 more months of state approval. That's my point.
It may be less, but yeah, that's.
That's in control of the state, though, and again, that's.
Well, I know,
you
but
know.
all I'm asking is that looking at it concurrently versus waiting, you know.
Well,
So,
the
we've
process will
talked-
be as we've described, is the best I can say.
If anybody's interested, I'll give a 2-second about.
Go for it, we're
So
glad to
once-
hear from you.
Once the zoning was approved in October 7th, I believe, then we commissioned architects and engineers to start looking at the plan. We did basically the same thing that Harriman did. We looked first at what you can do on the site now with all the restrictions that have been placed on it by the town and by Chapter 91. And basically, what we've come up with is, this is a very preliminary first draft, if you can hear me, is instead of putting the massing all on the waterfront side, so instead of putting the massing here,
The what, again?
the massing, the buildings, instead of putting the buildings here, we're trying to push it away to create as much public space as possible. So I don't know if you all can see that, but these aren't the final plans, they're literally the first draft. And these are just base elevation, we have no architecture yet, but as you heard us at the meetings over the past year, we're gonna make it look like it's been here for 100 years. But the idea is to create as much public space as possible, significantly more than the 25-foot setback. And so what the one change now, the one modification we're talking about in Chapter 91 is basically Paul's already answered, is that there's a small area here that maybe becomes private use versus public, then we give similar square footage over here, so this whole corner becomes a public park.
Okay, and because I want to get clarification myself, is that roughly what we're talking about the XX spaces are?
That is
Okay,
exactly it.
I'm going
I
to
just
stop you
need the
right there,
square
because
footage.
that was one of my biggest concerns is that, myself anyways, is that XX wasn't covering the whole orange space and beyond and growing into the monster that gobbled up Detroit. So it sounds like the XX is going to be a number that, because it's of concern to me anyways, as a select person, and I think you've said that before, publicly too, that it isn't all that big, so that's, that's good, interesting news.
There was 2 hours of conversation. I got up and I said, "You guys are gonna be really disappointed because we're
Right.
talking about a small piece of area,
Yeah.
and we wasted a lot of time." So, for example, this private area here and the lines here, maybe that becomes like this. But whatever we do, if we take a square footage, we have to give them back. But there's better square footage that we'd rather give to the town here along the harbor walk and here on the Golden Triangle than having public space here,
Me.
regardless.
Mm-hmm. So, okay.
All this.
So we'll be looking at that, yeah.
All the 91 is doing is not giving us any approvals or any rights to this, it's just giving us the right to go to the planning board.
And get their approval for this.
Planning board.
Yeah, right, yeah. Right, so let's see it. We've been waiting since May. We've learned a lot, though, and met a lot of interesting people.
So, thank you very much.
Oh, yeah, anything else, George?
Thank you, George.
Thank
anybody
you
has
for
any
those
questions?
visuals, George. Those were helpful.
No, excuse me, no, come up if you want to speak. Are you, anything, you're done, George?
I'll take questions from
Patrick Kennedy, 59 Jerusalem Road Drive. George, what would the XX number be under that trade-off proposal right there?
We can get that tomorrow.
Is it a small number or a large number?
Is it?
Well, it would be a relatively small number. It wouldn't be 1,000.
It's not gonna be 10,000.
No,
More than 1,000.
it'll be more than 1,000? Okay, whatever the number is, it'll be, and just bring it forth. And the process is clear, right? Okay, any other questions, commentaries, anything at all? 'Cause you'll be seeing us again at another open forum, but we're moving as quick as we can, okay? With that, okay, I can't help but advertise, this has been exciting. We got Wednesday night, an even more exciting meeting, because it'll be addressing this significant concern we have over aquaculture. Sorry to give an advertisement for our next meeting here, about our aquaculture and proposal in Briggs Harbor and so forth. So come back here, the same spot, 6:30 on Wednesday night, and we need your input and participation in that too. With that, this is over, and I'm going to take a motion to adjourn the meeting.
So moved.
Second. Okay, any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? This meeting's adjourned. Laura and Emily, thank you very much. Well done. Here. That was good.